Hi, I'm Rob McConnell. I teach graphic design at BYU Hawaii, and I wanted to share with you guys today one of the projects that we do in our typography class. I have the first thing, pretty much the first project that our students do as they get into the class is this type revival course. So if you're thinking about it in terms of their formal graphic design education, it's right at the very beginning. One of the first things they do is get into type design and how they learn about typography through that process. Before we get into exactly what the project is, just wanted to kind of give the background into where the project came from. And a lot of my work you'll find, or I found, that it's a combination and a growth and a kind of adaptation of a bunch of different projects or a bunch of different threads that kind of create into the finished piece, right? Very rarely is something going to come out of nothing, right? It's always going to be combined or recontextualized or adapted into the finished thing. And the first kind of thread that this project came from is my personal work. I did this Hamburge fontsiv project for about a year, where each week I would find a new sample or source of type. I tried to pick something that was not digital, so physical type or printed material or kind of lettered or something along those lines, and I would revive and iterate and create the 15 letters for the Hamburge fontsiv, right, as a kind of a proof of concept into the typeface. And I would do a different one each week because I found that it really let me explore and experiment and play around with an idea without getting bogged down. And some weeks they're bad and some weeks they're better. Some weeks I would focus on a technique or a style. And I just found it a really valuable learning experience. The other thread is kind of the source where this project came from. It was actually from a talk by Karen Chang at TypeCon in 2016. She shared projects that her students would do, making a typeface over the course of 3 or 4 weeks as a group. So I came and I did this for a couple semesters, and there were some really good things that came out of this. I really liked that it forced my students to look at typography up close, look at the letters, evaluate what makes an O an O, what makes a G. How do you make an O look like the same size and shape and look like it belongs in the same kind of category and typeface as the H or the A or the I? So I really liked this aspect that looking and designing type forced students to kind of evaluate type closer. It really helped create an appreciation for fonts and for typefaces and the work that goes into them. Some of the things that I didn't really like, students kind of got super nichey in maybe they were really good at doing the diagonals, right? But they would never be able to draw an S. Or maybe they got really good at identifying characteristics of a hairline sans serif, but they still didn't really have a good understanding of what makes a modern serif or where the kind of contrast goes or things like that. And so I knew I had this project. It was a good foundation, but I was going to put it back into the drawing board and see kind of what adaptations or changes I would make. The last kind of thread is just some ideas and things that I found when teaching. The first one, I don't think this is super revolutionary, but maybe it just needs to be stated for the sake of it. Don't do a project because that's what you did in undergrad or because somebody else did it. But really, when you're trying to go through the process of creating a project, it's called this backwards course design. Look at the results. Okay, what are the outcomes that I want my students to get? And then figure out, okay, how am I going to evaluate or engage? Did they get those outcomes? And then think about, okay, what kind of project can I give them that will force them to do that? And so come at it from the back end rather than saying, oh, this is a web design class, I'm going to make them do web design. But think about what are the results and what kind of projects lead to those results. And the last little nugget of teaching is just this kind of the amount of time that you spend on a project. I noticed looking at some longer projects that we had in my classes, students would learn a lot and they'd be super engaged and loving the project and kind of exploring and really growing. And then towards the end of them, if they were too long, they start to kind of taper and lose that interest or lose that skill, or they're not progressing as much. They're just kind of going through the motions and wrapping up the details of things, right? If the project is too short, then they just don't have time to kind of evaluate the results. They don't have time to fix the errors or the projects, right? They just kind of put it out there and that's all the time they have. They don't have time to kind of go back and refine, right? So I'm really trying to hit this sweet spot of what can I get them, where do they start tapering, right, in terms of this project. So realistically, what can a student do in 3 or 4 weeks? What's the project not going to be? What do I want them to learn from this? And I've kind of narrowed it down into these are my basic goals. I want them to learn the typefaces, learn what makes a letter, and really closely examine them, okay? I want them to understand and be able to classify and research types so they can distinguish the difference between a serif and a sans serif, the difference between different categories of serifs. And I want them to learn the quirks and traits and kind of optical corrections that need to go into type design and develop an eye for that. So when they go into choosing typefaces, or if they're experimenting with lettering, or if they go into type design, then they have that kind of foundation in their work. Things that the project wasn't going to be able to manage in that amount of time, I wanted them, again, they don't have to do the full alphabet A through Z, because then it doesn't allow them to explore a lot of different styles. So I would rather them just do this sample, like my project that I would do on my own, the sample of 15 letters, but then do that a couple different times so they can still get a little bit of breadth rather than an inch wide and a mile deep. So here's kind of the project criteria that I give them. Pretty much to sum it up, week 1, I wanted them to do a sans serif, and they could choose uppercase or lowercase. Week 2, we would do a serif, and they would do the opposite. So if they did uppercase the first week, the second week they would do lowercase. And I wanted their type to fit into one of those 7 classifications that we talk about. The old style, transitional, or modern serif, slab serif, geometric, grotesque, or humanist sans serifs. And I wanted them to pull from historical context, right? Don't just redesign an already existing digital font. Really look at printed materials or physical type and pull their inspiration from there. And I'm kind of evaluating and grading them on how well their typeface fits into those categories, how well they're using their anchors and handles. Can they make the spacing consistent? Can they make the letter shapes consistent, an even weight, the same size, kind of those optical corrections. So one of the first resources that I kind of pulled from, especially here in Hawaii, there's not a lot of physical type specimens within their easy reach. So we found this book, Printed Alphabets, by David Thomas, which had just specimen after specimen that they could pull from. So I didn't show them this book. I took this image and then I would purposely trim it down to a couple essential letters, right? I didn't want to give them all the answers. I want to force them to kind of look at it and say like, oh, I've got a K. How does that translate into this other letter? Oh, I have an uppercase R. I can maybe use that to draw my uppercase B, rather than just giving them the B and the answers there already. So I would give them these trimmed down specimens. As they're kind of looking at these specimens, I have them categorize them and do research on them. So how would you categorize this? Where does it fit in type history? And a lot of times the students that are good at research are probably going to find, hey, I'm pretty sure this is plantain, Or, I'm pretty sure that this is Bodoni that I've been doing and looking at. So I say, you know what, you're probably right. So what are the characteristics of that typeface? What are the characteristics of other typefaces that fall into similar categories? And use that to kind of guide your designs. Even still, using like a printed typeface versus a digital one, there's still some like ink bleed or other kind of inconsistencies that will show up. Do you make the serifs square, or do you make them little snub-nosed rounds? And those are kind of the decisions that they can make. So even though this has really tight restrictions, there is still a lot more flexibility in the creative options that students have in the project. If they didn't like any of the samples that I gave them, I would send them to this Flickr group. Again, with a stipulation, don't pick something that's digital, and don't choose a specimen that has all the letters, and kind of go through there. And so a lot of students would go through there and kind of look through specimens and kind of figure out which typefaces and do their projects from that. So you can see a couple different examples of that. I used to have, so this was a 3-week project. The 3rd week said, hey, you know what? I kind of controlled serif and sans serif the first 2 weeks. The 3rd week, you go and you do a typeface that you want, whatever you want. As long as it still sits in those kind of criteria, it's not a digital font, and the specimen shouldn't show all the letters that you're pulling from. So another good source for that was this movie title still collections, which has a lot of lettering from movie titles. For example, this great one for their Blue Ain't Hell. I can't even say that correctly, but this is a great example. Student found and kind of created into this project. Kind of taking a step back and thinking about, okay, how is this project? Where are the weaknesses, or kind of what am I playing around with, or what's not working up to this point? And a lot of it falls into, what am I doing with that extra week? Rather than doing a 3rd typeface of free choice, I've experimented, and they'll just go through and they'll refine their first 2 typefaces. So we spend a week just refining, and I found that to be really helpful. But part of me wonders, like, maybe that time could be better used at the beginning in the research. Should I force them to do a little bit of drafting by hand, or learning a little bit of the calligraphy, so they kind of get a sense of where are letters thick and thin, or how are serifs constructed? So I don't really have an answer to that yet. Would it be better to kind of, what do I do with that extra week, I guess? Some things that I did kind of find that I think are valuable beyond just the scope of, hey, this is a project that we do. Something that I think has value regardless of your area. I think there is value in a copy, right? Master's studies should still have a place, especially in art education. Not everything is about the end result. It's about the process of it. So there is a lot of value in going through and looking at existing type and recreating it and redrawing it and redesigning it. I think it's just knowing what the expectations and the end result is. You're not going to claim it as your own. You're probably not going to put it in your portfolio. You're not going to be making millions of dollars off of it. But I think there's value in that process, that later, once you kind of have that foundation, you can go and kind of start to adapt and change your work. The other thing that I think is really kind of useful, make space in your kind of practice for personal projects. Have that room where you can experiment, try, and fail things. Don't just have projects that go on and on and on and on. Not everything needs to be finished. Not everything needs to be perfect. And I think there's a lot of value in that kind of exploration and space where you can work and explore. And that's just one example that kind of my own personal work, how it seeps into my teaching practice, that if I didn't have personal work, who knows where my teaching practice would be, right? So here's a bunch of the sources that you guys can refer to and use. I've posted the project on the design teaching resource for AIGA with the rubric and the title sheet and some of the different readings that we do for the project. And then there's the links to those Flickr groups or the printed alphabets books or the movie title stills. But anyways, I'd just love to talk with you guys or kind of hear your feedback on where you think the project could be improved or any kind of outcome that you think this could be applied to. But anyways, thanks for letting me share. Bye.